you feel yourself moving in visibly into the picture. Then you hit that suggested rectangle at the bottom and you try to escape. Perhaps you take a diagonal to the left. Bumpy ride, but it takes you past the smoke, which is painted with his fingers and his thumb, white paint with just a touch of ultramarine, and you get to the top of the picture, the top left. And then you make your way across the top of the mill, trip over the balustrade, and are pierced by the church spire. If you know your 17th century painting theory, if you know the painting's a constable, you know that's an important part of a painting, just off centre. And it is mocked as you make your way out of the painting to the right by the finials of the pub. Traditionally the fastest way out of Manchester, and I'll be finding that out tomorrow when I go into town. So here's a picture that really is quite extraordinary in its ramifications. Historically, it's situated. Socially, it's situated. Geographically, it's situated. And there is the sun. Who says the sun doesn't shine in Manchester and Stockport and Salford? There is the sun weakly reflected in the windows of the mill. So it's also not just all these things, but it's also thinking out of a world Mr. Lowry found hard to accept, hard to understand, hard to comprehend. He has made something beautiful and perfect, in his own eyes at least. And, of course, that beauty is harmonious. The blacks are not black. They're the most wonderful admixtures of colours. And those subtlety of tones, gradually your eye gets into it. It's not like listening to Beethoven or Shostakovich. This is like listening to a string quartet. Just a few elements being played to the very height. So, all things considered, one of his great paintings, and it's in Southport. And where does it come from? Well, as I go through this lecture, I hope you will agree with me. Like every artist's work, it comes from a whole plethora of different sources. But one of the most important is the work of Charles Mérian. Charles Mérian was an etcher who etched Paris as it was being pulled down and rebuilt by Baron Haussmann, just before the Impressionists. And Baudelaire, who called for the painter of modern life in France and set the whole modernist thing going in France, wrote a wonderful essay about this man, believing him to be the first of the modern artists. Unfortunately, Mérian went mad and the book came to nothing, but some of the writings survived. And Mr. Lowry had a copy of a book about Charles Mérian in 1905. Before he met Villette and all that, he had this book of etchings. And if you read the bits of Baudelaire, which I'd love to do, we haven't got time, you could easily be describing a Lowry painting. Why is this important? Well, because Paris was a cradle of modernism, a cradle of modern art, so to speak. Lowry is the inheritor of that. He is our Van Gogh. He is our visual equivalent to T.S. Eliot. You know, not in every painting, but in his actual achievement. Take the best of what he did, and he is the representative of a way of seeing the world. He's on more books of sociology than you can possibly imagine, and I could go on. So a detail of this. Look at those figures on the balustrade, looking down. Look at the figures carrying the dead body. Look at the horizontals and verticals, the dark windows. Lowry took so much from this. And next week, I will show you how these etchings, through Lowry, are transposed to his late paintings of Berwick-on-Tweed, right at the end of his life. It's the most extraordinary, strange knotting of circumstance.
I wouldn't want to miss this next week through.
There's a word people use to describe Mr. Lowry's figures, and I promised somebody really important to Mr. Lowry. I would never, ever use that word, and you can possibly imagine what it is. Because it suggests that Mr. Lowry couldn't draw. Well, he could. He did this drawing at Manchester School of Art in the early 19-teens, just before the First World War. And it's, given what artists did at that time, it's not a bad drawing. It may look to us as a good drawing, but people were trained to do this kind of drawing back in the day. This is an 8-hour drawing. The pin marks at the top there, top left-hand corner, where he's put the picture up again and again. The corrections by his teacher, Monsieur Villette, can be seen around the figure, showing sort of the anatomy and the structure of the human body. But most importantly, you can see that Mr. Lowry can draw a breathing, palpable figure, conjuring a living, dynamic presence out of a flat piece of paper. And you can see that this presence, you can feel it. Look at that foot lying on the ground, the elbow resting on the top of the knee, and the hand supporting that chin. Mr. Lowry could draw adequately well, given the circumstances of his time. But he could also, when he got into his stride a little bit later on in the 1920s, draw like an angel. I will use some other artists' names. I'm not saying Mr. Lowry's as good as these. There's no value game going on here. It's more about ramifications and correspondences and relationships and friendships. Because, if you're an artist and you copy Rembrandt, you get to love the guy. You copy Van Gogh. This is how it's like somebody who's great enough to play Chopin. You have an intimate engagement with them. So this reminds me of a Rembrandt drawing. Rembrandt's in a class of his own, etc., etc. But look at this drawing. Isn't it brilliant? It's the Flatiron Church at the edge of Manchester. Behind the church is Salford. Strangeways Brewery is there. And we're looking towards Salford. And here's this wonderful evocation of place. And as we look at it, this has all been conjured up from a piece of coloured paper, just using black chalk, white chalk, and a lot of spit. So you pick up a Lowry drawing, always wear gloves. Because as he would draw, spit, rub, draw, spit, rub, draw, spit, rub. And then he would put in these great striations, these great strong verticals, and then these great energetic, sort of sensitive, broken lines. Frank Auerbach likes Lowry. You can see that sort of broken lines, but you see, like Auerbach's paintings and drawings, it means that these buildings are lived in. They're breathing buildings. We live in an old pipe factory, and I'm sitting in the kitchen at the moment. And people have lived here. We've had parties here. People lived here before we did. People will live here after we do. It'll change and shift. And so nothing's fixed. And those figures are figures in movement, moving through time and space. And each mark is a memory. As he takes his eye off the scene, before him, he draws it. Except, of course, he's drawing from a sketch. He may well have drawn this from life, we don't know, but that wasn't his practice. So this wonderful evocation of place. And again, that musicality. And I'll do this again, because it's just fantastic. One of the great ways of enjoying a painting or a drawing, when it's got that rhythm. And every drawing should have the rhythm of the human body. The mark should relate to the movement of the hand, which is why iPad drawings are a very different aesthetic. So look at those verticals, 1, 2, 3, 4, 1, 2, 3, 4, as you walk across the painting, walk into the drawing. And of course, when you walk, you have the same beat, 1, 2, 3, 4, 1, 2, 3. Your heart is beating. And so a good drawing, good Chinese landscape painting, picks up that rhythm. And as you look and you follow those rhythms, so your body engages as well as your mind, etc., etc. So he could draw and he could paint. He chose to draw and paint the way he did, the better to express what he wanted to picture, what he wanted to visualize. What he wanted to visualize was a private experience to life. Now, the best of Mr. Lowry is when he's painting like that. Unfortunately, for me anyway, his great success and market pressures and various other things meant that he did overproduce. And quite a lot of his paintings are good, but quite a lot of his paintings are brilliant. So let's think about the great brilliant ones. Paintings are made, and here is Lowry's palette. And if ever I find a guy or woman who clean that palette, I don't care how big they are, I'll punch them on the nose. Someone took this palette and cleaned it, and so lost the documentary evidence of how Mr. Lowry painted. What we can see here is famously Mr. Lowry only really used 4 colours. Very occasionally an orange would slip in or something, but normally just these 4 colours. Dirty red, which is vermilion, dirty yellow, which is yellow ochre, dirty blue, which is ultramarine, sometimes Prussian blue, flake white, and of course in his day you could use flake white, and ivory black, very dark, dense black. And these are basically the only colours he used. He didn't use any medium. In other words, he didn't use oil, linseed oil or turpentine to thin his paint. So if you think of Van Gogh, he used the same principles, straight onto the palette or straight onto the canvas. Gainsborough thins down his paint so it's almost like watercolour. So did Renoir, for example. So your man, Lowry, is a thick, opaque painter. So you get this wonderful, creamy, rich surface. He said famously, of course, I'm a simple man. Well, there's no such thing as a simple man. Well, people might disagree, but, we're all complicated. Look at the way I'm talking now, putting words together and all that sort of stuff. How do we do this? We are intelligent, complex creatures. But he did say, I'm a simple man, I use simple materials. Well, that was true. He uses very simple materials, very limited materials, as if he was playing a fiddle, just with 4 strings to his fiddle. But from those 4 strings, a violinist can produce the most wonderful nuance of infinite sounds. And a good painter does exactly the same. So let's see. This is the palette that he would actually normally use. And it's a piece of cardboard. And the reason why he liked cardboard was when you put oil paint onto cardboard, it leaches out the excess oil. A bit like butter. If you put butter on a piece of cardboard or brown paper, you get that oiliness. So it leaves the paint even stiffer than before. So one of the great things about Mr. Lowry's paintings that I can't really show you is the fact he carved into them, that they're actually scalloped like a beach or a stone wall. So Mr. Lowry would take a piece of canvas or a piece of hardboard or wood or something, panel, and he would cover it with flake white paint, very heavy lead-based paint. Then he would let it dry, leaving it sometimes for 3 years, sometimes longer. And he would wait for inspiration. He'd wait till he was ready. It would be wrapped up in a bit of a newspaper or brown paper under the bed, under the sofa, or wherever it might be. And when he was ready, he would take it out, take it up to his workshop, late at night, of course, and then he would cover the surface with another layer of white paint. In between those two would be a thin ream of oil, sort of yellowy golden colour. And that means that the paint he put on the top, a bit like a birthday cake or something, would be wet, tacky, and he would work into that. And essentially, although he'd have an idea what he was doing, perhaps from a drawing or something, he would then improvise, bringing it into harmony, bringing it into being, talking to himself all the time, listening to music of Donizetti and Bellini and others, Delibes as well, of course. So here we see his palette. Now, I've really asked you to look at this for quite a long time, because again, that string quartet analogy comes in. Only 3 colours, then black and white. And out of those 5 voices, he gets this wonderful melange of different tones. And remember what Georges Braque said, the wonderful Georges Braque said, the most beautiful colours in the world are those with no name. So Lowry's art takes time to get to know. You need to break through the popular image. You need to sit down. You should sit in natural light, although really sharp light, being directly on it, is a very powerful thing. So as the paint dried, of course, Mr. Lowry would then use his coup de grace. He would get a little pen or a pencil or a pin, a nail or a knife, and he would carve into the surface in the 1930s. And in doing so, his paintings become 3-dimensional, cutting into the figures, cutting around the figures, leaving them to stand proud and casting a slight shadow. So when you see a really good Lowry painting and you put a light on it, it comes alive, because obviously light changes all the time. So I hope you'll go to the Lowry in Salford or Manchester and see those fantastic paintings. Here he is at work. And here you can see what we've lost. See that palette? That's the palette we saw it seem all nicely cleaned up and shiny. And this makes it very clear that Mr. Lowry is a painter of whites, a tonal painter. He uses colour, but he uses it very, very specifically and with great subtlety. When Mr. Lowry exhibited at the Paris Salon in the late 20s and early 30s, he was known as the refined and delicate painter. The refined and delicate painter. Look at the way he's holding a little nail and he's scratching out the top layer of paint to reveal the white paint underneath. Because don't forget that ream of goldeny oil has leached from the white paint underneath. So the white paint underneath is pure and clean. So when he cuts into it, he gets a Vermeer-like quality, which is extraordinary. Ben Nicholson was doing something similar. It was quite a sort of technique people used, but Lowry was a master of it. So you get that wonderful Vermeer-like whiteness and that wonderful subtlety of tones. And then he would rub yellow ochre paint on the top surface to give it back that oiliness that people perhaps expect of an oil painting. Interesting too, there's his easel, and you can see that's amazing any paint got on the canvas at all. Primarily it's white paint, and he's got his back turned to us for very good reason, because Mr. Lowry had two suits, one to drag paint on and the other to spill food down. That's actually not true, but I always say it, and I always say it's not true. But there he is, very discreetly painting. And there he is, that refined, delicate painter, carving out the top layer of paint to reveal the white paint underneath. And as you can see, he cuts out people's legs and arms. And the faces are often blank as well, or very, very minimal. Now, there are two reasons for this. One is dark, and has to do with him going to Madame Tussauds and loving it when you could see the waxworks being taken apart and such like, and other things he used to get up to. But the other one, of course, is when you see a painting and if it has too much detail in it, like watching Coronation Street or a Hollywood movie, then you're passively just engorged by information. If you listen to something on the radio, then your imagination goes to work. And here we see, looking at these paintings, the figures are generic. They're very particularized in their stance and such like, but they're not highly finished. And when I was researching the Lowry book back in 1998, I sat for hours and hours and hours in Salford Art Gallery. And God, I was approached by some weird people. And some of them would come and stab me in the back with their fingers saying, "What are you looking at? That's the blood of the working class, the blood of the working class, blah, blah, blah." Then you get somebody else coming up saying, "I've got one of these hanging on my wall. They're very beautiful. And I think you'll find the chiaroscuro, whatever." And then you'd have other people coming up saying, "That's my Aunt Fanny there. I used to live just down that street, And there is one Lowry painting where I've had 3 doctors coming up to me, each of them at different times of my career, claiming to be the figure in the hospital painting of Anne Coates. So Lowry knows, that every artist knows, that it is the viewer that completes the painting. It is you who engage with Mr. Lowry, and the painting is this wonderful bridge that takes you not just to Mr.